Wildacogga, 20 Pine Knoll Court.
No charge for the new microphone.
I'm walking up here because I have 3 more of these letters from people who are not happy about the House of Worship resolution that I just got. I wonder what that is. There's like a fact.
You need to sign up. I'll call you.
All right, I'm not going to go quite as long as the other 2 individuals. I just want to say that tonight marks a year since this wonderful law or resolution was introduced to the residents of the village of Chestnut Ridge. And I want to continue to exercise my concern about it and register my distaste for how it was presented to us, the quality of the document we originally received with all the strange dates, and the fact that we have learned over the course of this past year that the resolution wasn't just dropped in the village of Chestnut Ridge in February of 2018, but rather the village began to work on it in August of 2018, maybe even earlier. And I resent the fact that my tax dollars were spent to benefit one segment of the population and didn't invite the rest of us to sit around the table and draft this law. Good night.
Thank you. Again, I think the village attorney in the past had basically addressed how a law gets considered, triggered, a need is brought up to the board, and we discuss it. Just as we had suggestions for our parade law, just like we've had suggestions for the special parade law special events, just as we've had suggestions for the entity disclosure, the rental registry, that gets started off with a conversation. And usually what will happen is I'll talk to the planner and I'll say, okay, we have a request with regard to a rental registry law. What do you think? And the planner will do some preliminary research. They will come back to the Board of Trustees, and they will say, well, this is what maybe you can do. Or we might go to the village attorney, and we'll say, okay, Mr. Village Attorney, we have a request with regard to, we seem to be having a lot of parcels that are being conveyed to entities as opposed to individuals. What can we do to better track the accountability with regard to the new owner? Because obviously you can't talk to an LLC. So the village attorney does some work preliminarily and says this is what you can do. So it is possible and it is conceivable that there will be a delay of a month or 2 or maybe 3 until the law actually is drafted, and then it is promulgated and or published for everyone to see and to comment on. So with regard to our House of Worship law, the engineer that was retained by the OJC contacted the planner to say, look, we have a suggestion. The planner, as part of his job, takes telephone calls. The planner then will ask, is this something that the Board of Trustees would like me to look into and address? And it is something that we said yes. It doesn't require a resolution to do that, because that's part of everyday government. And then what happened is, as you see, the planner did what planners do. They came up with a roadmap. The OJC did provide what they felt a model of was that they needed. Planner reviewed it. He came up with what he felt that would be a plan, and then he presented it to us ultimately in written form in February of 2018. And from there, that's when the official process starts. That triggers the review, that triggers the dissemination of the proposed law to the various agencies, town, county, to make sure that everyone has an ability to review it. So as you said, it's been about a year since the official unveiling okay, of the law, which is not unusual in that the fact of the matter is for almost a year now, this has been out in the open to the village. We've had 4 hearings. We have had people come to village board meetings outside of the hearings to also voice their opinion one way or the other. We have had professionals submit written submissions. We've had oral submissions. So the fact that you don't like the way your tax dollar is being spent on a house of worship law, well, for sake of argument,
what I said is I resented the fact that the law was drafted without participation from everybody in the village or different segments of the community, and I said that before.
all right, and there too, addressing that also is, to my knowledge, whenever we have had laws that address the village, we never established focus groups. We never went out and had pilot meetings with folks to say, look, this is what we're thinking, what do you think, things of that nature. That is triggered, for instance, with a comprehensive plan or with the corridor study, because that's also part of the law, where you have public hearings, you have groups that go and do that. Otherwise, if I have somebody come up to me and say, Mr. Mayor, we need to have a law with regard to tree cutting, and we've had that in the past, okay? I am not going to establish, and I am not going to institute many committees to talk about it. What we're going to do is, normally, we would draft a law, and we will entertain comment just as we do here. We will incorporate those comments, we will listen to those comments, and then we will proceed accordingly. So it is rare that a potential law is going to trigger a focus group. And it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way, and otherwise government would come to a grinding halt. So that's the best way for me to explain why we did not establish this.
Mr. Mayor, I think,
But I appreciate it.
Thank
I
you.
don't want to interrupt, but I would point out that there is a section in the zoning code, specifically Article 17, it's entitled Amendments, and it describes how there can be amendments to the law, and they can either be by the village board of its own motion or by the recommendation of the planning board. You know, that's an important part, because the planning board sits there and listens to land use applications and sometimes says to a board, gee, by the way, guys, we're getting a lot of applications on this, and we notice your law could use a tweak. Or, and that's what happened here, by petition. You know, someone sent a petition in and said, hey, something's going on, there ought to be a law. And that phrase has been repeated many times in the past. And that's, of course.
If there was anything submitted requesting this.
Well, it's actually in the record and on the website attached as an exhibit. But that's generally the genesis of how laws get written, be it for places like assembly or be it for entity disclosure. Someone makes a petition. Someone says there ought to be a law. It's drafted, and the very purpose of the public hearings that are held are for people to give public input to that law. I think there was, the last public hearing on the particular local law that's being considered by the board right now, there was an attorney who spoke at the public hearing, and he said, you know, this was a substantially watered down version of the original law that was presented, and you know, that was his characterization of the final version that's in front of the board. I would prefer to think of a substantially watered down version to be a version that took into account comments of the public that related to the substance of the law, comments of the planning board that related to the substance of the law, comments of the county that related to the substance of the law, and the various other agents, including the technical memos from the planner. But that's how laws get developed, and it's hard, particularly in emotional situations, when people at public hearings, the very purpose of which is to give public comment on the law, you know, kind of get away from that to voice other displeasure, and that wading through that, having read every transcript and every letter that was submitted to try to pull out comments that were good to incorporate into the final version, is something that is part of the municipal law. You know, they said this before, you know, making legislation is like making sausage. You know, not everything makes it in there, but a lot of stuff does.
Thank you, Mr. Sebastian. Next, Mr. Wasserman. Name and address for the record, please. Again, name and address for the record, Mr. Wasserman.
Jeff Wasserman, 365 South Pascat Road. Before I go into my prepared comments, I just want to comment on the discussion that we were just having. As a member of the planning board, when the planning board has a new application, the planning board hears in a public setting the applicant's reason for wanting the building that's desired. They come to us in a public setting and they make an application and a presentation as to why they're seeking approval. That's what's missing here from the village board. This applicant should have come to a public meeting and made a presentation and educated the village as to why they have a desire for the particular law.
Actually, you can finish your comments and I'll address it.
So it's with great loss to Chestnut Ridge if the board chooses to approve the poorly drafted and clearly just unclear house of worship blanket variances and justify them with false claims that federal and New York State law requires these changes. Those claims are simply not true. I'm disappointed that the village board has ignored the recommendations of my own planning board and is ready to strip the zoning board of appeals of their legitimate and important function. This village has a wonderful history that includes all types of diversity, and it's recognized by all residents as one of our strengths. The village board has an opportunity tonight to celebrate and defend this cultural mosaic by pausing and including all residents in the development of a comprehensive plan. Alternatively, the board can vote tonight to approve these amendments, motivated by the belief that they may well avoid a lawsuit by the OJC. Our residents deserve more from this board, and why would you approve amendments if the one group that asked for them is threatening to sue the village? Just doesn't make sense. Honestly, doesn't make sense. More discussion is needed. As some may recall, I stood here last month and clearly explained that our current code allows for houses of worship, and our zoning board grants land use variances, and that our village has not violated religious freedoms, thank God, and they've not violated the law in any way. As a member of the village planning board, I always ask myself two questions before any vote. Have I listened to all of the testimony? And do I understand the law or the code? Then I vote with my conscience. So before you move forward with your vote, I'd like to ask each board member 5 questions. 1, do you think that the village of Chestnut Ridge has a history of or current practice of discriminating against religious uses or groups? 2, do you think the village zoning and planning boards have prevented residents from practicing religious worship? 3, do you think the village board or any of its boards have been arbitrary or discriminatory in their decision-making process? 4, do you think the village zoning laws have been in violation of the federal Arlupa statute since the law was passed in 2000? And 5, has each board member personally and thoroughly reviewed all testimony and letters from residents in support and in opposition to this proposed amendment? If the mayor and trustees have voted no, answered no to any of these above questions, you shouldn't approve the proposed amendments, as passage of these proposed amendments will likely continue this community divisiveness created by this board, and the village could very well get sued, and I don't think anyone wants to see that happen. Rather than dividing and creating fear in all residents, this board should be stressing the importance of unifying our village. This board's actions on this issue are only some of the reasons why Anthony Shaw and I are running for the 2 village seats in the election that will be held just 26 days from today. Anthony and I look forward to continuing our honest and civil and respectful campaign. Thank you.
Mr. Washington.
I will say this, and I sincerely apologize, but, you know, there is litigation pending right now, and, you know, I would instruct and implore our board not to make comments on the record whether they believe they have or have not discriminated against people, because, you know, admitting or framing issues for people who are either contemplating suit or have filed suit against the village of Chestnut Ridge in a public forum is probably a really bad idea.
Thank you, and that is counsel we will take into consideration. Mr. Wasserman, at the very beginning, you talked about the fact that laws are brought to the attention of the Board of Trustees at public meetings, and then we move forward. That is incorrect. Not every law that this village ultimately drafts and passes is triggered by someone coming to a village board meeting to say, we need to do this, or we have a need for that. So that's an incorrect statement by saying that that's how it begins. It does not. The purpose or the key with governing is you have to stay ahead of the curve. You have to try to make sure that you aren't doing crisis management, that you're doing preventive maintenance. So I don't necessarily need to have a resident come to me and say, you know what, Mr. Mayor, I think you should talk about painting the curbs yellow. What we would try to do is we will try to be ahead of that to see what are other communities doing, what is going on. However, the flip side is you are absolutely correct to the degree that there are certain matters that are brought to our attention at public meetings, and we run forward with it. I was on the planning board also for 9 years, and there were a lot of comments made at planning board meetings saying, oh, the village should do this, or the village should do that. And for the most part, if it was a suggestion that probably had a little bit of meat to it, my recollection is, at least the 9 years that I was on the board, on the planning board, we may have a meeting, or we would have had a meeting or two with the village trustees. And they would hear us out, and they would say, you know what, that's a suggestion well made, or that's a great suggestion, but right now we can't embrace that. My recollection is, at least since I've been mayor, I have not been approached by any of the boards, albeit ARB, Architectural Review Board, Planning Board, or Zoning Board, with regard to comments being made at their public meetings saying, we have a need to do this, because if we did, we would consider it. Now, what we will probably do is we will try to be more communicative with the boards so that the village trustees stay ahead of the curve. That we're not going to wait for the boards to come to us. We're going to try to stay ahead of the curve. Now, your comment with regard to stripping the zoning board of its authority is totally incorrect. You do not govern by variance. You govern by zoning code and your laws. The zoning board of adjustment will not be losing any power. If someone is outside the parameters of the proposed law, they will have to go to the zoning board for approval. However, if, as a matter of right, which a religious use has already been determined to be, and there are no bulk issues with regard to the application, there is going to be an application process solely before the planning board. We did take some of the planning board's suggestions into consideration. The fact that you brought up, I don't mean you personally, the board brought up items that also fell outside the parameters of what the planning board is supposed to be doing. There were some comments where the planning board felt as though, you know what, we shouldn't be doing this. Well, you know what, the village trustees feel as though you should be doing it. So we drafted a law that says, planning board, you're going to oversee this. Now, if the planning board feels as though that they can't do that, I would hope that they would let us know that, and then we'll find people who can. But the whole idea is we pass a law, and you folks on the boards, respective boards, have to follow it. And we've had this conversation, Mr. Wasserman. You have said, look, whatever the law is, we're going to follow it. And I hold you to that.
Correct.
And I don't mean you personally again. I hold that to all of the boards, that they will follow the law, regardless of their personal disposition one way or the other. So, we are not taking authority away from anyone. If anything, the process that once this law, if it is passed this evening, is going to follow the same process that any other application before your board, the planning board, or the zoning board, or the architectural review board will take. There's no shortcuts. There will be full vetting. There will be a full opportunity for folks to come and speak on it, and then the board will look at the law. Does the application abide by it, or it does not? And the applicant will follow forward. And that's what, we're not doing anything different than what we've always done. And you spoke about a community in the village. Well, this will address certain needs of the community in the village. There are others that will maybe come in here, other denominations. Now they will also be able to have the same guideline, fair play for everyone. Anyone in any denomination is going to be reading from the same rule book. So, but I thank you for your comments, Mr. Washington.
Just think there would have been a better way to create more harmony and less divisiveness.
And reasonable minds will differ. And I agree. Okay, thank you. Mr. Sherrod, I believe you're up next. Name and address for the record, sir.
Anthony Shaw, 23 Milwaukee Drive.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Before I get started, can I just get some clarification on what you had said, Walter, earlier about the 12 to 6 timeline? Is that kind of zoning board approval when wanting to use it more than 3 times in a year, somewhere outside the scope of these amendments?
I think during the review of what started on the initial draft, I think my recollection is more than one denomination came in and said, look, we do have some worship nights, be it a midnight mass or be it some other sunrise service or some other name of some type of rite that I, unfortunately, being raised on the Catholic, have no idea.
Meeting of the brethren.
Right now,
Meeting of the
when they
brethren.
say they may, there may be times when we are worshiping at hours that are off hours. So an alteration was made to the law to put a limit on that. And you may say it's arbitrary, but it seemed to be redefined regularly scheduled in each of those instances as more than 3 times. So
Right, so this is saying
more than
no.
3 times, you got to go to the ZBA and you got to get approval to do it. And similarly, following up on the mayor's point, for the community place of worship, the larger place of worship, really not a whole heck of a lot that's changed between what we have now and what this provides, other than codifying certain restrictions aimed at lessening impacts on neighboring properties that weren't codified before.
Okay.
Next question.
That variance, that's for regularly scheduled use between the hours of 12 and 6? So
Yes.
there's no limit to outside the hours of 12 and 6?
Correct. That's considered regular worship time.
Okay, understood. And outside of the regular worship time, there are social gatherings and other things permitted under the MPW classification
Sure.
up until 12 o'clock at night and starting at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Correct. As is carried on with other denominations in the village, whether it be the mosque, the Forster Church, or the soon-to-be Coptic Church. Correct. I said Coptic Church, excuse me.
So that kind
One
of brings me,
conversation at a time. Sorry, Mr. Shiro.
no problem.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So that kind of brings me to my next question. Some of those other organizations that you've mentioned are on larger pieces of property. The way the MPWs are currently defined within the law, you can have them on lots as small as 0.34 acres in an R15 zone or 0.57 acres in an R25 zone. So you've got small lots next to small lots with large gatherings up until midnight and beginning at 6 o'clock in the morning. that you don't have with other denominations?
Actually, we do, and you cannot restrict when folks can gather for prayer or for worship, because the law says you can. Now, what happens is, because you're going to be on a smaller parcel of property, the number of people that are going to be in that structure will be scaled down. The Foster Church is on 5 acres of property. They could have, at any given point in time, 750 to 800 people if they so choose to do that. Excuse me. However, if you're on an R15 or an R25 conforming piece of property, the structure that you build and the amount of people that will be able to be in that structure will be triggered or will be guided by the fire codes, the building codes, and things of that nature. You're not going to have 750 people on an R25. You cannot do that. It's not going to be done.
Right, that assumes our code enforcement shows up to count the number of people.
Yes,
that
Mr.
are-
Sherrod, of course.
Correct. I would add, Mr. Mayor, and again, I don't mean to interrupt, but, part of what has been observed by me at least, and I think by a majority of the board during the course of the public hearings on this proposed local law, is that there's a fundamental disagreement on the requirement of municipalities to allow and accommodate through neutral laws that apply to everybody, legitimate practice and assembly of religion within the community. I found this disagreement to be really, really deep. But some of it actually boiled down to people saying, look, these houses of worship do not belong in residential neighborhoods. And, that's not the law. And reasonable people can differ whether that is a just state of the law or a reasonable state of the law. But frankly, whether when those cases started getting decided and these statutes started getting drafted, that legislators really envisioned worship of a particular denomination in homes versus traditional buildings of larger size and larger lots. But that those decisions are there and they're made, and the village is bound by them. And you walk at a razor's edge in trying to balance, accommodation versus protection of neighboring properties. And I think one of the things that was overlooked, even by the professionals who reviewed the law that was in front of the village board at this time, is that there are a lot more codified protections to try to help screen neighbors from impacts, be it assembly or religious uses, that simply don't exist in the current code. To try to navigate that difficult balance. And I think some of these questions on a more, cerebral, analysis are what were they thinking of when they said, religious uses are inherently beneficial to neighborhoods, period, regardless of the impact on neighbors, regardless of traffic, regardless on impact of tax base. But that's the law. So we're going to,
Thank you.
We have to live with what we have.
Thank you, Mr. Sebastian. Anything else, Mr. Sherrod?
Again, kind of going back to something that you had said earlier tonight, you talk about kind of these focus groups and these discussions that we didn't have before this law came into play, or the draft of it came into play.